Squirrels! So hello, and welcome to another Legends of Runeterra video. My name is Chris, and today we will be talking about the Targon Problem. Now, this is going to be, more of a podcast kind of thing. There's not going to be too much going on the screen. I will flick to certain cards and whatnot, but you can essentially just put it in the background and listen to my lovely voice. But with that said, we are going to be talking about, more card design balance things because... if you've watched this channel long enough that I love that, and we're going to be comparing Targon to another region to see, what went wrong in terms of the ideas and the balance behind Targon that has led it to being in this state where it's just, completely, I would say, dominant. And if TF Fizz didn't exist, I think there would be a lot of outrage at how Targon has been designed. And so we're going to get into that right now. But before we get into talking about Targon, we are first going to just talk about the general idea of creating regions. And this goes pretty much as far back as card games themselves, with the start of Magic the Gathering, and literally within the first set, this idea of having these different colors that do different things well and bad was already established in the game and has pretty much continued throughout Magic's life. And we see pretty much the same thing happening in every card game, that whatever faction or region or color you are in, that thing will have certain strengths and certain weaknesses. And we can see here in Magic, you've got the 5 colors there, and they each have, characteristics that they are trying to promote, and that will also come with certain weaknesses that they struggle to deal with more so. One example of this might be something like a green card in Magic. A purely green card will never say destroy all creatures. There will never be a green card in Magic that says destroy all creatures. It just simply will not happen, because that goes against pretty much everything that the green side of Magic is trying to do. And so we can see that, certain cards and regions shouldn't have access to certain ideas, and that's a very important point when you are designing a card game. So now back into Runeterra, but before we tackle Targon, let's first look at another region so we can sort of compare the two and see where things have gone right and wrong. I think Demacia is a pretty easy region to sort of identify as, in terms of what it does well and what it does badly. So we're going to just look at Demacia because I think it's a fairly simple example. We can start off with Demacia's strengths, of course. It is sort of a well-statted unit region. I mean, we could see it with these top row of champions here. They have access to decent keywords as well, like Challenger, Quick Attack, and Regeneration. Challenger being, of course, a big focus of Demacia, but we also have stuff like barriers as well that are common in Demacia. Another thing Demacia has going for it is the use of some nice combat tricks. Stuff like Ranger's Resolve and Sharp Sight, of course, are very effective in certain situations, and can, somewhat, Ranger's Resolve can potentially even win a game because it can be so effective. So that's another thing that Demacia kind of has going for it. It has some nice combat tricks that you can use and hopefully, help your well-statted units survive. Finally, another thing that Demacia is kind of seen as is the rally region. It has more rally than any other region. Of course, Katarina and Noxus and Shunpo and Noxus have some rally effects, but really, if you look here, you can see that Demacia is the main region for rally effects, and of course, that is one of its major strengths. Moving on to Demacia's weaknesses, we can see here Demacia really struggles with card draw. It only has 2 cards in the entire region that say draw on them, and those 2 cards as well are very conditional in how they draw and are somewhat dependent on what your opponent does. Of course, if your opponent removes Dragon Chow, it won't get any draw. And if your opponent, doesn't kill a unit, or, you can't find a way to kill a unit, I guess, then also you won't get the card draw from Vanguard Redeemer. So card draw is, of course, one of Demacia's big weaknesses. Another thing Demacia can struggle with is certain keywords. As we can see here, there's only 1 elusive unit in the entirety of Demacia, and it isn't that great of a card either. There's only 1 lifesteal card, and that's Radiant Guardian, and that, of course, is conditional as well. And then, of course, the only Overwhelm keyword in the entirety of Demacia is actually on Lux's Final Spark. There actually isn't any other Overwhelm in Demacia whatsoever. So certain keywords and certain ideas Demacia can struggle with, and you can add on to that it doesn't have any lifesteal or life gaining cards or healing cards outside of Radiant Guardian either. And finally, the last Demacian weakness we'll talk about here is the fact that the removal often is using strike effects, like single combat, concerted strike, strafing strike, molten breath, judgment. They're all kind of strike effects, and that's the main way that Demacia tries to remove opponents. And of course, that is a weakness because it can be interacted with by your opponent pretty easily. If that unit gets removed, then of course the effect might not go off or might not get the kill that you so desire. So now let's look at Targon then. What is the Targon problem? Well, let's start off with Targon's strength. Of course, one of Targon's big strengths is the fact that it has access to a lot of created cards. You're never going to run out of steam. There's a lot of draw, and there's a lot of created cards with the Celestials and or Aphelios' moon weapons as well that allow you to essentially never run out of steam. The idea is that you're going to finish the game with 5+ cards in hand no matter what. Whether you win, whether you lose, you will essentially should have 5 cards in hand, and that's one of the big strengths of Targon. The longer the game goes, you've got more options than your opponent, so therefore you should be able to pull out the win. Targon, of course, has access to Spell Shield as well, which is a very useful keyword in terms of protecting its units. Obviously, most commonly associated with Bastion, but of course, going forward, this probably will continue to be one of Targon's main strengths, is the use of Spell Shield, and that, you know, it can protect its units very well. Adding on to that is the idea that Targon can heal its units very well, also through gems or through things like Guiding Touch or Star Spring or Star Shaping even. You know, there's plenty of ways that you can heal your own units in Targon. But this also comes with the idea that certain spells can also heal your own Nexus as well. We see it, of course, with Guiding Touch and Star Shaping. We also see it in stuff like Broadback Protector or Resplendent Stellarcorn. And right there we run into our first problem, because you might have thought, well, you've always got card advantage, so the longer the game goes, you know, the higher likelihood chance that Targon has of winning. Well, of course, if you can heal your Nexus enough, doesn't that mean that the game is going to go on long anyway, and then shouldn't you win? Well, yes, that is our first problem with Targon, is that healing is probably too abundant in Targon, if we're being honest. Healing your own Nexus, I mean. I have no problem with the idea of healing your own units, but healing the Nexus, I think, should be one thing that they look to tone down with Targon in this next balance patch, and I'd be surprised if they didn't, because whilst things like Broadback Protector, I think, are okay, and stuff like Stellarcorn here, I think is okay, I have a much bigger problem with something like Star Shaping and Guiding Touch. I think these cards are just a bit too good, and I think they would be a lot more fair if they could only heal units. And I think I would prefer it if spells in Targon can only heal units rather than the Nexus as well, because otherwise I feel like you're just giving too big of an advantage to Targon straight away, because as I say, the longer the game goes, the higher chance they have of winning, and if you have enough life gain in that region as well, well then the game is almost guaranteed to go on quite a long time. But now let's turn to some of Targon's weaknesses, or supposed weaknesses, because of course Targon is meant to sort of struggle with direct removal. It's not something that Targon should really have. Removal is always going to be hard to come by, and really the only way you're meant to come by it is through the Celestial cards, with stuff like Fallen Comet, Meteor Shower, maybe even Equinox. Now, I've stated problems with Equinox before because it's a 1-mana spell that essentially acts as removal on certain cards, like Nebulae Collector and Leviathan being two big examples. So in theory then, if you're talking about a slow region with a real lack of, you know, hard removal, shouldn't that mean that something like an all-in Fiora deck should stomp on Targon, right? That should be like an auto win. They can't aggro you down quick enough, and they, you know, maybe they can find Comet, but really that's really going to be their only way out against something like all-in Fiora. But then we run into our next problem. And our next problem is a card like Hush. Because Hush is such a flexible card and such a powerful card that something like All-in Fiora, like I said, that should have a pretty good matchup against Targon because it's slow and it doesn't have direct removal, in fact, loses heavily to Targon simply because of Hush. Because Hush is such a powerful, flexible card that it undoes all of that weakness. That weakness is gone. And something like All-in Fiora hates seeing Targon because of Hush, because it removes all the things that that deck wants to do. And that's a problem. Again, we've ran into our big second problem, is that Targon has a card which undoes almost single-handedly one of the big weaknesses of the region. And now we come to our big final problem with Targon. And that is that its main weakness, I would say, the number one weakness for Targon, I think, was designed to be that it is a low tempo region. Yes, you're going to finish the game with 5 cards, but you're not going to have enough mana to spend all of those cards. And, you know, I'm just going to beat you down before you ever get to use those cards anyway. That's the idea with Targon, right? That you're not going to be able to survive. We've already talked about how the lifesteal is kind of a problem regarding that anyway. But also, there is another big problem with a card that came out recently. And that is, of course, the Vale Temple. Because the Vale Temple, again, single-handedly, completely undoes what is meant to be the biggest weakness in the entire region. This would be like giving Demacia a 3-mana draw 2 card. Like, not only does it undo one of, you know, your main weaknesses, but it's also one of your best cards in any region anyway, in terms of undoing that weakness. It would be insane if they ever printed a 3-mana draw 2 in Demacia, and I'm sure most of you would think they would never do that. But then here we are with the Vale Temple, which essentially is the same thing, because you're meant to play small units, as I just showed with Solari Priestess, right? It's a 3-mana 1/2. Sure, you get a card from it, but, you know, you're not going to get time to play that card. That's meant to be the weakness. But the Vale Temple undoes all of that. All of a sudden, that 3-mana 1/2 quickly turns into a 3/4. So the stat line is gone. The weak stat line, no problem. And also, you refill 2 mana each round, which essentially is going to let you play every single card in your hand, which essentially just leads to a game where you are playing with more cards than your opponent the entire game through at the same pace. Well, which side's going to win? Spoiler alert, it's the side with more cards. And I don't know what they were thinking when they printed this card. It doesn't make really any sense to me. This should really be a card that is unplayable, in my opinion. This, I would give the biggest nerf to this that I think you can, which is like 2 or 3 mana up. Like, make this cost 6. And I'm being serious, because this card should not exist in Targon. It simply shouldn't exist. Now, they're not going to just simply delete the card. They, of course, could redesign it, but I think if they want to keep the card as it is, I am genuinely serious when I say make this 6 mana, because this card single-handedly undoes Targon's biggest weakness. Now, I would be shocked if this card doesn't see a nerf in some way, but I think they need to realize, why did we print this card? Why did we go crazy with this and print a card that essentially undoes a main weakness of Targon? It's baffling to me, but essentially all of these different things have come together to create a region that simply has no weaknesses. The game will always go long because of the great healing available to Targon. That's the first problem. Removal isn't really too big of an issue because of Hush, and Hush is so flexible, using it both offensively and defensively, that your opponent is always stuck in a pretty bad situation. And finally, the fact that the Vale Temple can just simply undo any tempo loss in the early game and just, you know, completely swing the board and essentially give you more cards than your opponent for the entire rest of the game is, of course, again, a big problem. So, if I was right, what I would do is, of course, look at 4 main cards: Star Shaping, the Vale Temple, Hush, and Aphelios, and I would tackle all of them to try and give Targon a sense of a weakness again. Yes, it can still have strength in terms of being able to create cards, and if the game goes long, then I'm going to win, and any control meta should be, you know, a good place for Targon to be in, because generally, you know, they can go longer than even control decks. And that should be where Targon aims to be. But right now, it's, well, Targon can play at any pace because, you know, we've got all the best cards. So I'd be looking at tackling those 4 cards. And yeah, this was just a little ramble about card design here and what went wrong with Targon. And I hope that we see a change in the next balance patch, because I think it's very warranted for Targon. And I think most people are probably a bit bored of Targon, because I think it's kind of a boring region, partly because it has no weaknesses. So yeah, that's that's been this video on the Targon problem. I hope you enjoyed. Please feel free to leave a comment down below of what you think. I'm sure, you know, there are plenty of other strengths and weaknesses to the regions that I mentioned, of course, so, you know, I just mentioned a few just to quickly sort of illustrate a point. But yeah, I am going to leave you and love you, and I'll see you tomorrow with more Legends of Runeterra content.